This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London FinTech Podcast, episode 38. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Renton to discuss some key highlights from the Lendit Europe 2015 conference, especially for those of you who weren't there, and even for those of you who were there, as in the afternoon it's split into two streams. Peter was on the show in LFP038 way back last December, wearing his Lend Academy hat, relating to us the amazing story of the development of P2P in the US, something he saw from its very origins when nobody cared about it at all. Today he's joining me wearing his Lendit conference hat. Lendit now runs by far the world's largest online lending conferences. Some 2,500 people attended the 2015 Lendit US, 500 attended Lendit China, and yesterday around 750 Lendit Europe. So Lendit has become the go-to conference in P2P, and just like the industry, it grew from nothing, and so maybe we can hear about its genesis and the secrets of its success. There were many interesting presentations yesterday, although to be honest, as always, one or two were rather washed over me, particularly in my post-holiday jet lag. As always, wandering out of the sessions is also very useful when the going gets too tough and produces plenty of time to catch up on interesting chat and gossip. One of the formats of sessions is a fireside chat, where Peter is in essence doing a podcast live, just chatting. So I thought I would take a leaf out of Peter's book. There's far too much material in the conference to summarise, and all of the content will be made available online by Lendit. I'll include links in the show notes. So instead of trying to produce a school essay summary, and helped in my case by a slight case of excess gin and tonics in the after party, we'll just kick around the things that leapt out to us as the most interesting things going on in the P2P industry in the autumn of 2015. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Peter. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Hi Mike, thanks for having me.
And as listeners will probably tell already, or maybe tell soon, as I say, for people like you and I who are insiders in the industry, it's really important to get out there and do plenty of drinking. And you certainly, by the sound of your voice, managed to do that last night.
Yes, we had quite a nice evening last night. Firstly, we had out the drinks at the show, at the Lendit show, which was very enjoyable. Then I went out to the funding circle party last night and stayed out quite late, although not as late as many of the others, but I still managed to have a good time.
Well, you're not quite as old as me. Your age still begins with a 4 and mine has just sort of tipped over into a 5 a little while ago. But we were talking about the fact that one of the challenges for folks like us in this industry is that there are so many 20-somethings and 30-somethings who can keep going non-stop for quite a long time on the drinking and partying front and all that kind of thing, and then still appear the next day and put a professional job in. So coming on to Lendit, as I say, at one stage P2P didn't exist at all, and you were there right at the nascence of the industry in the US. And of course, go back 10 years, there was no such thing as Lendit conferences. So where did it all come from, and how come you have been incredibly successful at growing it?
Well, in some ways it was very serendipitous because...
Was it lucky as well?
It was, but I'd had Lend Academy for a while, for 2.5 years, and some of my readers were saying, we should all get together and have a conference. And at the time I thought, well, I don't really know how to put on a conference. It just wasn't something that I thought I could pull off. And I kept on coming up, and then I got an email from my fellow Lendit co-founders in January, and I'd set a resolution. I decided in 2013, somehow, some way, because this idea kept coming up, I was going to have a conference.
Even if it was in the pub, as it were, over a pizza.
Exactly. And so I didn't have very grand plans at all, but anyway, I had this email from Dara Albright, one of our co-founders, and got together with her and Jason Jones and Bo Bruskern, who are all co-founders, and we all got together in New York to discuss putting on a conference, and we got on really well, and we started planning out the first Lendit conference, which was in June of 2013 in New York.
And how many people came to that one then, roughly?
We had about 350 people at that one. We knew we were onto something. There'd never been a conference before in this space. I knew we'd get some people, because I had the Lend Academy readers who were all telling me, I'm going to come.
Yeah.
So I knew we'd have thought we'd get at least 100 people. We just didn't know, but we put it out there, and we booked a room for 225 people. We had to, plonk down $100,000 in guarantees, and we started marketing this thing. And next thing you know, we more than did our 225 that we were really hoping for, and we ended up, we had to shut it down. We were sold out. We turned 50 to 75 people away.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing on one of your excellent podcasts, and maybe you were talking with Jason, the story of those early days when, as you say, you book a room, you put your money on the line, you're sort of sitting there chewing the ends of your fingers, and then before you know it, you're employing bouncers to throw them out of the back. And so there's a number of things in that story which is relevant to fintech or to any entrepreneurs. I mean, the first of which is that you're responding to what people want, rather than sitting in a room on your own going, can I have a good idea? Oh, I've had a good idea, I'll go out and sell it. No, it's sort of other people pushing you into it. And then secondly, having got the sort of validated demand, I think you were just happy to give it a go and start small and see how that worked. Thirdly, you had the balls to go out there and stick your money on the line, so you could have lost money as a true capitalist. And then fourthly, which always helps in everything in life, you happened to be at the right place at the right time, which also
It was certainly lucky.
And then fortunate, I think, because it's easy to get something like that, but there's still quite a lot of execution involved in going from 2013 to 2.5 years later, where you're getting over, probably 5,000 people around the world have gone to a Lendit conference this year. So how did the next 2 years of growth work in terms of what were the secrets of that, looking back in it?
So I think one of the important pieces that we did, and this was before we even put the first conference together, the major players in the industry, I went around personally and visited them and said, we're putting on this conference, will you support it? And we didn't want a huge amount of money back then, we just wanted them to commit to sending people. It'd be great if they would sponsor. So we got probably the top 10 to 15 platforms to all commit to coming to the first Lendit. And that really was what drove the success. And the reason we're able to do that is because I had built up these relationships over a 2.5 year period. I was covering them on Lendit Academy, I knew them personally, and this was a way I felt like was sort of to take the industry to the next level where we all go and attend a conference which hadn't been done before.
Absolutely. So I think you have been, again, without flattering you for the sake of flattering you, I think you have been clearly a key part in the evolution and growth of the industry. I think if this hadn't happened, then it wouldn't have grown as it has. Now, sure, someone else would have had the idea at some point in time to do it, but nevertheless, you were the one who got out there and made it happen. So, fast forwarding a bit to yesterday, which even through the lack of sleep and slight alcohol haze, we can still sort of vaguely remember, it's actually quite an interesting way of approaching it, in that whatever is stuck in your mind and stuck in my mind must be quite important to cut through that sort of the haze of goodness knows how many hours of presentations and PowerPoint slides yesterday. So I've got some things that leap out at me, but as you're the one who's read all the material in the first place, Peter, why don't you sort of shoot with some of the things that you thought were really impressive and that people who were unable to be at the show or to watch it online, which I think is very impressive of you guys to share it in that way, that people who weren't there or didn't see it online, that they really ought to know about?
Sure. So I think, we kicked off the day yesterday morning with Samir Desai, the CEO and co-founder of Funding Circle, making the announcement that they have purchased Zencap. And that's a really big deal because Funding Circle are already the leaders in small business lending because they've had a very successful UK operation, they've got a very successful US operation, and now this brings them into 3 countries in Europe. And so with that acquisition, they're sort of the undisputed global leader, and they've really putting their stake in the ground, saying we are going to be a global player here. And many of the other platforms are not doing that. I mean, sure, there's some that are in a couple of countries. Some of the European platforms are in multiple countries, but those are all pretty small. Funding Circle is going at scale, and having them in this deal, doing multiple countries, I think it's great for the industry. It's great, obviously, for Funding Circle, assuming they can pull this off. And I think it's going to be something that we'll look back on and say this was
landmark.
Yeah, this is a landmark or a turning point in our industry.
I think it is, and one of the interesting things to me, sort of zooming up macroeconomically, is that the forces towards oligopolization in any segment of the economy these days are very strong. So, once you're successful, you pull away, you raise more money, that enables you to pull away faster.
Right.
And just leaping around in another presentation, Rupert Taylor of Alt5 Data yesterday showed a very interesting chart, which is the share of the top 3 players in the UK as a percentage of the overall marketplace.
That was fascinating to me.
And that's been collapsing for many years, although I think something like the last 12 months it's been increasing. So the top 3 are now pulling away.
Well, as you expect. I mean, the top 3 were actually the first 3, pretty much. So, you expect them, they had 100% for a while. And now it went all the way down. I think it was below 50. But in the last 12 months, they're starting to pull away. They're scaling quicker than the entire rest of the industry is growing. So I thought that was fascinating.
And I don't know about Zencap in detail, but off the top of my head, and actually may have been in your blog that I read it, Peter, is that although they're based in Germany, don't they also do business in Spain and Holland? So
yes.
In principle, it doesn't give Funding Circle something like 5 countries, it's quotes in.
Yeah, exactly. They're in 5 countries now. And actually was sitting next to one of the Zencap co-founders last night at dinner, and he was explaining the fact that they started in Germany, then they started in Spain right after they started in Germany, but they soon realized it's not easy to just start up an operation in another country, even in the Eurozone. They said they had to really put focus, and they really decided to double down and build Spain in a way that was rather than just doing it in a more off-the-cuff way, they really sort of focused on it. And I think they've got 3 countries in Europe. I mean, they're a young platform. They only launched in 2014, so it's not like they've been going a long time. But Funding Circle, obviously, I'm sure they've done due diligence on dozens of platforms and decided this was a good fit for them. It's
all about sticking your flags on the map. It's the new empires that we're building at the moment. So that's one of the exciting things, or perhaps the most exciting thing that's happening in the industry at the moment. Set against that, as I say, I went on holiday for a couple of weeks and chairing the risk panel in the afternoon, which we might touch on in a minute. I started with the fact that let's not talk about both my weeks of the holiday, but just in terms of my last week of the holiday, which I found out about when I came back. TrustBuddy, of course, had a little local difficulty and is basically blown up by what appears to be some internal fraud. I released last podcast before this one, which was with Platform Black, talking about the significant losses that they had in a tranche and the huge crisis in their business and how they moved on from that. And also Syndicate Room and Gonzalo, who I'm a great fan of. They did the first kind of exit interview, as it were, with an investment of theirs which had got entirely wiped out, and they were very open and said, look, this is what happens. And so, in a sense, it's all about, I think, the industry growing up, which says that, things are going to go wrong. These are risky investments,
right.
And we're seeing that now. So there's a whole sort of series of things there. And so what did you make of the TrustBuddy, Peter?
So I think it's interesting because in some ways it was the major topic of conversation yesterday at the conference was the TrustBuddy failure. And now we heard about the fraud, and now earlier this week we heard about the bankruptcy. One of the things that was fascinating to me on the institutional investor panel, we had all of the 3 publicly listed funds, P2P GI, Victory Park and Ranger, all talking about this. I think it was the Harsh from Victory Park made the comment. He says, well, any one of us would have picked up in due diligence that there was something fishy going on. We would not have participated in the platform. So it's clear that this is something that got through a lot of people's due diligence. But then I had another conversation yesterday with a small platform in Spain who said people do due diligence on him. And he said most of the players that come in are clueless and they don't really know what questions to ask.
I think that's much more the case in terms of what I hear. Some of the ones are, of course, very professional, but in terms of the investment, for example, so we'll talk about institutional money, moving on to that topic, which is a very big one at the moment, is, again, the propaganda is that the institutions are sitting there with superior credit analysis skills and yada, 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 yada. Now, I heard this, and I did a bit of consulting about 20 years ago in the fund of funds industry in the UK. And I went to see one player, and it was superior analysis, superior performance. We really select the hedge funds, we've got the best people, blah, blah, blah. It's a bit like the Wizard of Oz, because actually you go there and you pull the curtain, and Oz may look great, but actually there's a bloke pulling the levers. And in this case, I remember it's just imprinted on my mind. They just got a list of all the returns in the hedge funds, and they would flick through it and just go for the biggest numbers. Actually, that was the reality of it. So I'm always reminded in FS of Georgian houses in Bath. And Georgian houses in Bath look really beautiful from the front, but the back, there's actually quite often being propped up by wood, and the architects never paid much attention. So, your mileage may vary depending on these institutions. And in a world of spin and media manipulation, everyone says they're great and they're really professional, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's only over time that we're going to see who is actually adding value above their fees.
I think that's true, and I think they're really, a track record is going to dictate that. Now, the thing that's challenging is that not many of these investors, even the 3 publicly listed funds, they don't have a long track record. Yeah. But, just from what I've heard around, just talking with different people, is those 3 players do excellent due diligence. I think a lot of the people who are not committed to this space, who either doing this as part of a whole broad investment, maybe their due diligence isn't as strong enough. And, I think, obviously retail investors, they're not going to do the kind of due diligence. They don't even have access to do the kind of due diligence that these other institutional investors have. So it's going to be easy for them to miss it. And I don't blame the investors on TrustBuddy because they wouldn't have known some of this stuff, the small investors. Now, the larger investors, I think, from what I've heard, these are questions that people should have been asking.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's interesting to see how it goes. I mean, certainly I'm just thinking that, various platforms have moaned to me about the time that some of these due diligences have taken.
Yeah, it's painful.
Said against that, one rather wonders, in a world where fairly soon in the UK anyway, all platforms will be regulated by the FCA, why there is actually, quote, say, need for due diligence, unquote. For example, you go to a restaurant around the corner here, then in principle, health and safety and all that kind of stuff applies, and you shouldn't get food poisoning. In the way that if you're eating somewhere in India, you probably are going to get food poisoning.
That's one of the other things that has actually been discussed here at Lendit, was that this wouldn't happen today in the UK. The regulations we have in place with the FCA here, it would have made this much more difficult to have pulled off in the UK. Now, having said that, there's all kinds of ways to do fraud. There are. And so, that specific case might not have been prevented, but, I think under any regulatory structure, there's going to be some bad actors, and they're going to dig and probe and find ways that they can maybe skim some money off the top or do something bad to get some easy money for themselves. So I think you've obviously got to find a balance between protecting the consumer and having regulations that actually support the industry. I think the FCA, they've provided a good balance. It's certainly far superior to what we have in the US, I can tell you that.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure that's true, and it's all relative. And there's a whole other topic about regulation, and I've written about it, having seen it over 30 years of my life, going from regulation of structure, which in American terms means things like Glass-Steagall, which were there to say that actually these are the structures of the industry, through in the 1990s economic regulation, where people said, Japanese banks have got all this capital, but it's just equity gains and that kind of stuff. And since 2008, regulation of minutiae in general in FS, which I think personally is a complete disaster. And there's a lot about trying to keep the regulator happy. I know lawyers who, this is in old FS, who have been called in by what was then the FSA and said, look, these guys have pissed us off. We want to find something they're doing wrong. So you have to be very careful. And I've noticed that a large number of UK players have come out in the press and said, regulation's wonderful, we're entirely behind it. But when I talk to them after a few beers, they've actually got some private whinges as well. So It's quite a tricky one. However, I saw coming in this morning, it was a very good tweet from the FCA regulator, who had a very good philosophy. You'll remember his name because you were here and I was stuck on a tube, who was saying that a regulator should be like a structural engineer, making sure the buildings don't fall down, rather similar to my analogy about making sure that people don't give you food that's going to give you food poisoning, but he shouldn't add to the architecture. He shouldn't dictate the menu. It's all in progress. On the institutional capital, just coming to that one, I think one of the things that stuck out to me is very interesting. Well, let's take a step back. So institutional capital can be seen, and I've tweeted about this, as re-intermediation. You can say that the whole of fintech is about a certain amount of disintermediation, removing the man in the middle, reducing the cut the man in the middle takes, etc., etc. My concern with institutional stuff is that, as you say, they do add value around the due diligence. Whether they actually add whatever it is, 1.5% per annum and 15% carry in terms of performance fees, and once you compound that over 10 years, remains to be seen. I'm very sceptical, having seen the investment trust industry in 30 years, whether they do. I'm somebody who's stuck all my money in index funds or ETFs, and I've outperformed all of my mates over the long run. So we've got this re-intermediation phase, but we've also now got what I call an anti-re-intermediation phase. So the likes of Funding Circle have got their fund, and Lendit Investor are rumoured to be looking at a fund as well, and I think Samir may have said something yesterday along the lines that it ain't going to have any fees or something like that. Right.
It's the P2P summit at Lendit today, and I think you were in the room when Kevin Cayley from ThinCats was talking this morning and basically saying, that P2P is dead or it's under threat. And part of what he was talking about was what you just said there, that these institutional investors are just going to overtake, and why would you bother having small individual investors? If you can get 4 investors who want to put in £200 million, why would you want to deal with retail? Yes, what would you want to deal with retail? Now, I dispute that, because there's many platforms in the US who are 100% focused on institutional investment. But the 2 largest platforms both have a retail component still. Lending Club, largest in the world, they have 100,000 retail investors who still, and I'm one of them, they are still getting a good deal. They have been very careful to make sure their institutional investors are not, cherry picking the best loans and leaving the dregs for the retail. They basically have a separate platform, completely separate for the retail and the institutional, and they randomly allocate loans between the two. And people have done studies to test, is it really random? And yes, it is. It is random.
Well, talking about banks love having a diversity of funding source. So there's a great strength in that business models. And there's also this point as well that, of course, you should get better value. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that all the leading players do such a free fund. I really feel that, as just as an investment strategy, if I take $1,000 and stick them in all in the top 5 platforms via one of their free ETFs or something like that, then I'm going to outperform whatever the professional can actually add value. Because again, when Samir was talking yesterday, he was saying Funding Circle, Andrew Mullinger made the same point when he was on the podcast. They go to quite a lot of trouble to try and essentially come up with the correct pricing.
Right.
So the likes of you as an investor, you've spoken about this in the States, and your investment record, you make it public, which is really very good, which is that it's got harder and harder to add value over time.
Yep.
Basically arbitraging their poor pricing, because they got better and better at sort of giving you more efficient pricing.
Right. Well, Rupert from AltFi Data did an excellent presentation yesterday that showed some of the things. What was interesting to me was that the Funding Circle, the returns for individual investors and institutional investors were almost identical.
I was amazed at that, yeah.
Yes. But for some of the others, there's a big spread. But part of the reason for that, like the Zopa with Uber, for example, that partnership with Uber, that is not available to the retail investor at Zopa. And it may be rightly so. It's a new product. It's a higher risk product, potentially. They felt like it really suited an institutional investor. And so I think, and they've got other programs like that where, and in the US, there's the same sort of thing that's happening where, there's these sort of pilot programs, newer things that are happening, which they don't really want to expose the retail investor because it is risky, and they want to give it to an institutional investor who is going to do their due diligence and say, that is risky, I know. The average APRs of some of these things are in the high teens or even low 20s. And so, institutional investors going in saying, yep, we've done our diligence, we are willing to risk our capital, and we understand that, this whole thing could blow up and we're in trouble. Yeah,
well, I think Rupert's one is one of the must download, or a must go and have a look at on the interweb presentations, and the chart you're referring to, I remember very well. I was sitting right at the back, and 750 people in the room is quite a lot. And he produced this chart, but actually there were a bunch of red dots in the top right.
Yes.
Taking a step back, for those people who don't know, AltFi Data in the UK is collecting every single deal that the big platforms do. They've got the data on every single deal. So they show you a chart over time of what the interest rates were and all these kind of things. Suddenly, quotes out of the blue, Zopa, who'd been a very conservative platform with fairly low yield, suddenly have a whole bunch of red dots, which were the institutional money, which is the ones that don't go through their safeguard fund or provision fund, around the 20% mark, and those are the Uber deals. So I think that's a very interesting development there. Talking of must-download presentations, you gave a very good introduction to Cormac Leach's must-download presentation by saying that you'd read it on the plane coming over, and it seemed to me that it was sort of a 3-hour presentation, but Cormac had said he could do it in 20 minutes. And I think both those statements are actually correct. I think it was a 3-hour presentation. I think it's a reference source now. Cormac is a brilliant guy, has lots of original ideas, and, you can differ on some of them, but actually it's really a core reference document about what's happening in the industry at the moment and where he thinks it's going, and some controversial things like he believes that continental Europe may overtake the UK. That may or may not happen. However, I'd really recommend that people really check that one out. And he did actually manage to rush through it in 20 minutes. So what were the things that stuck out in your mind from that? And there are millions of points that we could talk about.
Yeah, there was so much data in that presentation. But let's just take a couple. One thing that surprised me that I didn't know, and he said there's been more growth in the P2P lending platforms today from existing investors putting in more money than from new investors coming in. I thought that was fascinating. I'm like that. I started off with $500 in Lending Club, and now I've got well into the 6 figures in there. So I'm part of that story, and I think, but we don't have this sort of situation where we're getting hundreds of thousands of investors flocking. Now, with the ISAs coming in, maybe that will change things, but that was one of the many things that I thought was interesting in Cormac's speech. I think, he talked about, continental Europe has been held back by the regulatory environment, but he seems to think that it's going to boom and overtake the UK, as you say. Whether that's true, we will find out. Some of the things that were a little more, out there, shall we say, but I think the thing I appreciate about Cormac is that he's an ideas man. He comes up with new ideas that no one else is talking about.
One of which was tracking every single thing that goes on in the banking system so you could work out what the frauds are.
Yeah, well, that's why he said, have a repository for every single transaction, every single loan, every single payment. If you're buying something on the public markets in the US, for example, an equities trade or bond trade, there is a repository of all that information. And we don't have that yet in this country. And the other thing that was really out there, I talked to him over beers last night about it, and he sticks by it. He says that central banks should go and buy portfolios of marketplace lending.
Oh, yes, exactly.
So,
well, I think that's giving the listeners a feel that this was a vast cornucopia of everything from advice to the Bank of England through how to conquer fraud, through projections of the UK. And it certainly was rather like the scene from Apocalypse Now, where they're on LSD below the bridge and it's all blowing off around your head. And just fast forward that scene in Apocalypse Now, you may get an idea. Just picking up on one of those, Peter, because I'd like to sort of just wrap up on this final point. I think we've touched on quite a few key things here, which brings us to the risk. So You very kindly asked me to moderate, or perhaps it was provoke, the risk panel yesterday. And Cormac's point, I have heard from one or two of the players actually, which is that the growth of the industry, in large part, apart from the institutional money, which is a separate phenomenon, is coming from the people who've been investing for some time, investing more and more as they get more comfortable. And I think, to me, the challenge that the industry has got at the moment is making the risk simple, clear, and quantifiable to those people who haven't yet invested in it. And obviously with ISAs coming in next year, this is going to be even more important. On Thursday, I'm doing a week of seminars for me and conferences. I'm doing the Alternative Investment Summit, which David Stevenson is chairing the day. And this is really aimed at IFAs. No doubt I'm there to talk about it, or risk or something like that. Totally forgotten at the moment. I'll find out tomorrow, no doubt. And, if they ask me how to assess the risk, I'll say, well, actually, I've been writing a dozen articles this year, and as somebody who's got 30 years risk experience in the city, I can't assess the risk. And going back to the panel yesterday, we'd spoken in a conference call with all of us about what questions crop up, and there were a huge range of very interesting questions from, strategically, are the banks going to fight back, to what kind of data we're allowed to use in the US versus the UK to assess credit risk, and all these things are extremely important, extremely valid. However, you and I were talking, and we came back to this key point that I've been mentioning for some time. I did talk to the P2P FA earlier in the year, which is the simple question that I'd asked them, and it'll be available on video to see, and everyone will be able to judge, as to the simple question. Look, I stick £1,000 in your platform. What am I likely to get back in 5 years? If it's fair weather or foul weather, just let me know. Is it 1,400 to 1,500? Is it 1,000 to 2,000?
Is it zero?
Is it zero? What's the chance of that? So it's a really simple question. And, I've got a view on this, and maybe I'm right and maybe I'm wrong, and people can watch it online. But I think the interesting thing for me was that next to nobody actually quantified it. And I asked the audience at the end how many of the audience felt that they could actually even get some feel about the risk of the 5 platforms on the stage, 5 very big, 5 key platforms. And out of about 100 or 200 in the audience, only 4 people put their hand up. So I think it's one of the bleeding edge things of the industry. I've been banging on about it for some time. I don't quite know why, but actually I think it is in the interest of the industry. And I think it's a very simple thing for the industry to say. In some cases, we were talking about Lendit Invest before, and I was talking to Kristen yesterday. Lendit Invest so far haven't lost a penny.
Right.
So the first thing to say is, okay, well, in terms of risk, past isn't a guide to the future, but historically, we haven't lost a penny. No, sometime we're all going to lose it. The second thing, which is very simple, and Funding Circle have done it, and Land Bay have done it, this isn't rocket science, is to give your portfolio to external experts. And in the case of Land Bay, John Goodall and I did a podcast specifically on this. He talks about how to do it. They hired my academics, who are experts in the property sector, and you say to the external people, look, run this portfolio through the Bank of England stress test, which is what the banks have to do. Now, that may not be the one's going to happen, it probably isn't, but actually that's what the banks are doing. And you get numbers back there, and I've forgotten what it is, but for the sake of argument, Land Bay, because they've got this belt and braces approach, a buy-to-let, they've got the capital value of the asset, but also they've got the cash flow, the rentals. Their downside was 0.5% in that. I think Funding Circles are 1 or something. So that's very easy to do. So actually, there's quite a lot to do, and personally, because I spoke to these people over beers as well, I'm a bit mystified why they don't. I mean, you've got a bit of a further view from across the pond.
Well, I was thinking that maybe the P2PFA should make it mandatory.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a cost involved in doing that, and it's not insignificant, I imagine. But to me, it's such a critical piece, and we've got to keep in mind that we have been in this perfect environment for many years as this industry has grown from really over the last 5 years, shall we say. You couldn't have created a more perfect environment for this industry to grow. So I think it's a valid point. What happens when it's not a perfect environment? No,
I know, and I get frustrated because this should be easy. I mean, I think eventually our point will get through, and it will be helpful to investors and to the industry itself. But after poking them through the bars with a stick, trying to get them to come up with a number and just cutting in when they were sort of waffling, I did say to them that tech geniuses such as yourself should find it very easy to have a button for your investor, which you press the button, let's say Peter Renton's portfolio on Lending Club, and you press this button, it says, in the stress test scenario, you might lose 1.3%, taking into account how many assets you've got, the maturity, and yada yada. That's a computer can do that, and it does do it in banks.
Right. Well, it's interesting at Lending Club these days, when you make an investment, it tells you the range of likely returns.
Okay, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly what I've been banging on about the whole year, which is that, do you know what? If it's pessimistic outlook, you're probably going to make 3.7%. If it's optimistic, you make 5.2%. No one's going to hold you to these numbers, but it gives you a feel, doesn't it?
Exactly, and I think that's why I think obviously Lending Club have decided to do that. And the thing that's good about where we are today is we've all been through this once in a generation or multi-generation financial crisis, so we know what can happen. Yeah. It's not like we've gone through 50 years of boom times and nothing bad has happened. Then it would be more difficult. We all know that bad stuff happens.
Absolutely. Anyway, the industry isn't perfect yet, which is what makes conferences like this interesting, which makes the conversation today interesting, because stuff is always changing. You know, in some senses, they drag their heels just like the old boys do. So there was an article in the FT a few weeks ago talking about the fact that most peer-to-peers, some do, most peer-to-peers don't disclose the fees. Some do. Landbay does. I think Market Invoice does, off the top of my head. They tell the investor what the fees that they're taking, and of course they need to take a fee. But there was an article, I won't mention who, but some of the big names of the industry were saying, well, it's really not very easy to tell you what the investors, what the fees are, and it might confuse them and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, there's always things happening. So talking of always things happening, Peter, the Lendit conference show rolls on forever. We're in full session now. In a few months' time, you'll recover from all your hangovers and that kind of thing. And so the next thing up on the Lendit conference schedule is the US in 2016.
Yes, indeed. We have our next conference after this one wraps up, which will be in a few hours as we're recording this. We have Lendit USA 2016 in San Francisco on April 11th and 12th next year. We're anticipating, well, we had 2,500 last year. We think the industry is still growing. We're anticipating 4,000 plus people in San Francisco next year. Then, you know, we will go throughout the year. We're actually having our first Lendit China event where we do it solo. In the last 2 years, we have partnered with another conference. This time in China, we're going it alone and producing our own conference July 15th to 18th of 2016. And we'll be back here in London on October 11th and 12th next year.
Well, as I say, it really is the go-to conference if you're interested in the industry at all, and I've been interested to see that some investors come along to this to learn about what's going on. It's very professional. There's a lot of interesting presentations out there. There's a lot of chances to network, chat to people, chat to them informally over the beers. And as I say, for those people who can't make it, I think it's immensely generous of you that you make it available to watch online for free if people want to see it or see the sessions, and you make the content available after. And I'm very pleased to see that your generosity towards the community is being repaid in terms of success, and long may it continue. So thank you for that, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on iTunes or your podcast app, or sign up at londonfintechpodcast.com for email alerts on new episodes. Live long and prosper.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.